humanity has always longed for a hero that would defeat death, that would come on the scene and defeat death. We've been telling that story ever since the fall. The difference is Jesus comes and does it. He fulfilled what was in our hearts, what was written on our hearts. And this is why we engage with things like and relate to stories like Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings, stories like Hunger Games, every origin story of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? All of these stories are the exact same story on repeat, right? And yet we continue to pay money to go and see them. Why is that? What's going on there? This story structure engages with all people across all cultures, across all time, across all language barriers, because it's the story that was written on our hearts. It's the story that's hardwired into us. That's why we engage and relate to it. Hey, I want to talk about the importance of story and story structure. Dan Harmon says that without semblance of structure, a story is not recognizable as a story. In a previous video, I talked about how important story is to the God that we serve. It's a part of his characteristic. I think that he's passionate about it. I believe that he has hardwired us to engage with story and relate to one another with story. Right? It's the primary tool in which he uses to communicate to us through his word, is story. He has hardwired us to engage with story. Specifically, though, he's hardwired us to engage with a single story structure. C.S. Lewis argued that Christ is the fulfillment of the monomyth. Adam and Eve, Noah, Joseph, Moses, Samson, David, Jonah, Jesus, and the greater biblical narrative all follow a single story structure, a monomythic story structure. Joseph Campbell, who created the hero's journey, or the monomyth, argued that this story structure was just through evolution a part of our DNA. But as followers of Christ, we know that that's not true. We know that we've been created in the image of God, that he has created us and designed us, that he has hardwired us to engage with this story structure. And so, because we believe that we serve a God that has created us in his image, we don't believe that it's just a part of our DNA, that it happened by happenstance through evolution. And so, if there is a story structure that God has used and has hardwired on our hearts, that he has used as the primary tool in which to communicate with us, then I think that we need to take notice of that story structure. We need to take notice of it as we think through our digital practices and our content creation around our stories and around our testimonies. Joseph Campbell saw in the stories of the ancient world stories like Hercules and Adonis and Attis and Dionysus, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf. In Roman mythology, we see Ceres, the Corn King, right? Savitri in Hindu mythology, Osiris of Egyptian mythology, Inanna and Tammuz from Mesopotamian mythology, and Buddha from Buddhism. All of these myths are heroes who died and rose again, right? This story is written on our hearts. We had hoped for all of humanity since the fall, leading up to Christ. We had hoped for a hero that could come on the scene and defeat death. Right? This is always been our hope. The difference between these stories and Jesus is that he actually did it. The difference is his story is real, right? And so humanity has always longed for a hero that would defeat death, that would come on the scene and defeat death. We've been telling that story ever since the fall. The difference is Jesus comes and does it. He fulfilled what was in our hearts, what was written on our hearts. He comes on the scene and his story follows the story structure that was written on our hearts. And this is why we engage with things like and relate to stories like Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings, stories like Hunger Games, every origin story of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Harry Potter. All of these stories are the exact same story on repeat, right? And yet we continue to pay money to go and see them. Why is that? What's going on there? This story structure engages with all people across all cultures, across all time, across all language barriers, because it's the story that was written on our hearts. It's the story that's hardwired into us. It's why we engage and relate to it. And so how do we engage with all peoples across all cultures, across all language groups? We do so through story and testimony, and specifically using a story structure that was written on our hearts, that we've been hardwired to engage with, that God has written on our hearts since the beginning of time. And then through his son's death and resurrection came and fulfilled. He came and fulfilled that monomyth that was written on our hearts. And so when we tell stories, we have been given the blueprint. When we share testimony, when we testify of what God has done in our hearts, we don't have to wonder what to say or how to say it or what story structure to follow when we testify of what God has done. We have the blueprint. It's simply a matter of taking our stories and our testimonies and plugging it into that blueprint. I've talked with many ministries over the years who struggle to engage and relate stories from the field to their audience, right? How can we bridge that gap? That's a question that is often asked. It becomes really difficult, especially when most of the quote unquote stories that we're telling are really our strategy videos and our about us videos, and look at how great our work is and look at our cause and all the statistics around our cause. Those things are necessary. They have a place, but we're leading with that. We're not really telling stories. And when we start thinking about how do we engage with people through story across these language barriers, there is a story structure to follow, right? When I hear a story of a little girl who's been trafficked in India, that my experience can never really truly relate to her experience if I don't tell it in a way that is relatable to my own experience, right? Her upbringing, her experience, her life is drastically different than mine. And so just telling about a series of events is never going to relate across those cultural barriers because that's not even remotely close to what I've experienced. But we all live this cycle. We all live this monomythic hero's journey cycle in our lives on repeat over and over and over again, right? And so in the same way, we can tell her story using this story structure and ensure that it's going to relate to an audience here, maybe in the West, or some other cultural difference in our communication, because it's told in a way that I'm living out my life, right? We are all living this story structure, this story cycle in our lives. And so when we tell stories and we give testimony of what God has done in real people's lives, and we follow a story structure, it's going to ensure that it crosses those cultural barriers, right? And so as we think about story and testimony and using that to reach an unengaged and unreached world in the digital space, we have to think through our structure. We have to think through what are some of the plug and play models that we can take our testimonies in and plug them into so that we can make our process, our storytelling process, more consistent with greater regularity, because we know within the digital space that's so crucial. So I just wanted to share this because I think that it's something that needs to be talked about. It's something that we need to think through within the church as we start thinking through how do we use testimony and story to engage with an unreached and unengaged world. How do we tell stories that cross cultural barriers, cross language barriers? I would argue that we do it by using a story structure that we know has been written on all people's hearts across all time, across all humanity, and do it in a way that's going to relate to all people. And so, that's the call. Let's start thinking through this. Let's start using story and testimony to the benefit of the church and for the sake of the gospel, because he deserves the glory. Thanks. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in and listening to this episode. If you'd like to learn more about any of the stuff that we've discussed in this video or any of our previous videos, head over to reliantcreative.org, RELIANT creative.org. We've got a ton of free resources over there. We got courses, articles, podcasts, ebooks, all free. We're trying to help the church testify of all that Jesus is doing. And so all the content we're producing is with that greater vision in mind. Thanks so much for tuning in. We appreciate your attention.